Claude Levi-Strauss was one of the most significant names in anthropology in the 20th century, important not only for his influence within the field of anthropology, but also on his influence on what we now know as theory more generally, what we now know as structuralist approaches to literature, and of course the reaction that we would perhaps label post-structuralism. In short, his structuralism posited that behind all myths, all legends, all narratives of mankind in its various forms is a consistent structure that can be altered. Different slots, different ideas, different archetypes can be moved around to different places, which will have a certain significance. But ultimately, there is this underlying grammar, you could say, of mankind's narratives. And this idea had a massive effect on literary theory, on how critics of the time approached texts and tried to perceive this invariant structure lying underneath perhaps the most disparate sources. Ultimately, of course, this would be criticised by the likes of Jacques Derrida, and in another video, which I'll put the link to in the description, I've tried to explain the issues Derrida had with Levi-Strauss's approach and what we might call post-structuralism with Derrida, how that differs from Levi-Strauss's structuralism. But in this video, I want to go a bit more into his memoir Tristes Tropiques. It's a fantastic book packed with fascinating details from his early years as an anthropologist, his time spent in the field with various Brazilian tribes, and it's just an enjoyable read. Lots of historical detail, lots of things that are very memorable and will stick in your mind. But as the title suggests, which could be translated as something like Alas for the Tropics, it's a very melancholy book. It's about the way that indigenous ways of life, rooted in hunting, gathering, maybe some agriculture, about how these ways of life were starting to pass away, how many languages were falling out of existence. And it becomes very clear that while Levi-Strauss claims to be a Marxist of sorts, he really has no love for industrial civilization or hope, really, that it can bring about a better future than the past that these groups already had. And this very much ties in with an outlook that's become known as Anarcho-Primitivism, as represented by figures like John Zerzan or Derek Jensen. And such thinkers would say that actually the problem mankind faces, what's really causing our self-destruction, is not capitalism, it's not even industrialism, as much as that is a significant factor for them. It's civilization as a whole. It's agricultural civilization. That is the moment of the fall, you could say, for them, when mankind starts manipulating the earth, starts exhausting the soil and its fertility. And they're right to say that this caused problems from very early on. In ancient Greece, there's much written at the time. I think even Plato wrote about soil fertility being degraded and causing Greece's downfall. And the same goes for ancient Rome. And obviously the same applies now as industrial agriculture increasingly tries to boost soil fertility with imported fertilizers. But as we're warned, this might ultimately be making things worse and lead to a complete collapse in the not so far future. And in many senses, this outlook is not a political program. There's no way back for us, for me. There's no way back to being hunter-gatherers without a colossal amount of mass deaths, which few would want to see. So if they are correct in this, and I have some sympathy with the view, I think that it may well be the case that hunter-gatherers have the only truly sustainable way of life. But if this is the case, we are in a tight bind. We're in a really tight place in history, and it's not utterly clear what we should do next. Someone like Paul Kingsnorth has been trying to sit in that space, trying to ask, how do we react to this situation where environmental devastation, catastrophe seems almost irreversible or unavoidable now? What is our next step to take? How are we to foster attitudes to get through this? And as much as I might look a bit askance at some aspects of anarcho-primitivism, particularly the anarcho bit, I don't think that indigenous peoples had an egalitarian society. I think patriarchy and other forms of hierarchy were probably usually around. It is an outlook that I think is important, at the very least as a radical critique, and something that makes you ask even bigger questions than just how are we going to reform this current system we're in. Because certainly as long as we try and assume that mankind can persist with a modern industrialized lifestyle without consequences, I think the worst things will just get in that way. So at the very least, it's not going to make things worse to ask these bigger questions and to ask, is there wisdom? Are there important outlooks, perspectives on the world, ways of living with nature that indigenous groups had and have that we desperately need to learn from? And to that end, Levi-Strauss's work is important in cutting down some of the arrogance of modern Western civilization, as we might call it. Of course, we could say that in focusing so much on structure, while he does link this to the material conditions of the tribe's lives, and he does try and express how their myths and legends are an expression of sort of problem solving things to do with their society and their material lives. I think Frederick Jameson's criticism of Levi-Strauss holds true, that for Levi-Strauss, the cultural superstructure that he's discussing can sometimes seem like its own self-contained world, its own self-referential world that kind of isn't always clearly linked into the material conditions of the time. And so rather than suggesting there is this invariant structure that's somehow innate to all of mankind, it might be best to suggest that mankind's invariant problems of wresting a subsistence from the world, of wrestling with nature, tends to result in similar narratives, similar ways of using stories and art to solve problems, to reinforce the kind of society needed to deal with the world, to deal with nature, and to ensure survival in the times to come. And this is why on this channel stories, literature mean so much to me, because I think they're expressions of the sort of way a civilization has tried to solve problems like this, maybe wrongly, maybe in ways that are very tenuous. And it should challenge us to think, what stories do we need now? What stories don't we need? And that's a question I can't fully answer, but it's a question that I would love to explore with you and to hear what you have to think about it.